huge dumps that Disney took on our childhoods with the sequels. 3 members of the San Francisco Board of Education were recalled this week. Massively. They lost by between 72% and 79%. These were the virtue signaling maniacs who wanted to change the names of all the schools, wouldn't reopen the schools, yada, yada. And this really frustrated, and they wanted to get rid of elite AP classes. All of this.
They did, Jason. They did.
They did, yeah. And these 3 board members are out. So London Breed,
in the middle, Jason, just to be clear, in the middle of a pandemic, I think my understanding is that instead of figuring out how to get these kids back in class, how to figure out how they could take off their masks, they wanted to drop Abraham Lincoln and George Washington's name from schools because it was too regressive.
Yep.
They canceled the gifted program because it made other kids feel bad. And a gentleman that wanted to serve on a committee who I think was gay but not minority was excluded because he wasn't a minority enough for them. So these are the 3 people that 76% of San Francisco citizens or residents just recalled.
And if you're not following this, the tech industry had a major part in this in terms of backing it. There was a lot of claims, which I'll let Sacks address in a moment, that this was a Republican-driven, out-of-state movement. But if you look, there are not 100,000 Republicans in San Francisco in all likelihood. This was actually parents, in a lot of cases, based on the geography of San Francisco and the density of certain populations. A lot of Asian Americans came out in force. In some neighborhoods, 90% were voting to oust these people. Gary Tan, who is a product of the San Francisco public education system and a great entrepreneur and venture capitalist, was a leader in this movement. So congratulations to him. And this all is going to culminate, I think, in May or June, Sacks will correct me, with the recall effort for Chesaboudin, this killer DA who won't prosecute anybody. Sacks, what are your thoughts on this victory? And full disclosure, you were a major donor to this.
I was the 2nd largest donor, and I was the largest donor under age 90. Arthur Rock was the biggest donor. What a badass, by the way. The guy's 95 years old. He donated $400,000 to this recall. He was
in fairness, you live in San Francisco. Yes. This is a backdoor issue for you. You care about this.
Yeah. Look, I think crime in schools are the key quality of life issues in any community, and it transcends partisan boundaries. If your kids cannot get a quality education and you cannot be safe in your community, nothing else matters. And that matters to Democrats just as much as Republicans. And that's why, like you said, 3/4 of San Francisco voted for this recall, even though 85% of them voted for Biden. It's basically a 90% Democrat city. So, all these claims that it was a Republican recall turned out to be nonsense. This was something that was broadly supported. And look, it's the same reason that Youngkin flipped a, +10 Democrat state in Virginia, which is that, it had a lot to do with school closures. They kept the schools closed for a year and a half. And then when they were supposed to have a PTA meeting about reopening it, like Chamath said, they spent 5 hours debating whether to allow this beloved gay parent onto a voluntary school board. They didn't. They spent all their time, talking about changing the names of the schools instead of how to reopen them. There's chronic mismanagement. I mean, the school's something like $125 million in debt, despite, being in a very rich city.
They opened for one day.
That's right.
Just so that they could get a state piece of the state budget pie. So these kids clamored back to school just so that they could technically say, yeah, we were open, and to get, I think it was a $12 or $13 million check, and then they shut the schools down again.
Right. And you brought up a key point, Jason, which is that the Asian American community in San Francisco has been absolutely galvanized by this issue, because this school board also, Lowell High School is one of the best schools in the city, and it was merit-based, and it had great advanced math programs. And this board basically got rid of all of that stuff. And it infuriated the Asian American community, many of whose most prominent members have basically risen out of poverty because of the education they got at Lowell. And so this war on merit that's happening is something that is going to, flip the, Asian American community, I think, to...
When I was growing up, I grew up in a French ghetto of Ottawa. And I was supposed to go to a local high school that was just plainly trash. And I was able to go to an equivalent of Lowell, a public magnet high school that had advanced classes and everything, a gifted program. And it really did change my life. And so I really understand what people are saying, which is like when you're in poverty, the only way out is through an education, really. You may get accidentally lucky, but the only really predictable, sustainable pattern here is through school. And so when you deprive folks from being able to get a decent education, and there's no real, orderly logic to it, it's a really ridiculous kind of an idea. The other thing is, I think that this speaks very powerfully, as Sacks said, as a bipartisan issue that these Democrats have to get right, because you saw this also in Virginia, where Democrats basically went down this one tack, and the Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin basically said, "Hey, listen, the schools are broken. It completely doesn't make any sense. We oppose a lot of what's going on, the watering down and the critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera." And he put it to a vote, and a lot of people crossed the aisle there as well, where typically ardent Democrats basically voted for this Republican governor. I think the point is that there are just several issues that are just so they transcend all party lines. And this is an anchor issue that we have to get right.
Friedberg, any thoughts on this? Do you think this is the start of maybe a turnaround for San Francisco? Because Chesapeake is way more hated, and safety is an even bigger issue, I think, for a lot of people right now in San Francisco. And it dovetails with Asian hate and the number of Asian people targeted in crimes. So he's got to, if these people got out by 75% on average, he's going to be out by 95%. Is this a tipping point? Is San Francisco going to make a rebound?
I don't know. Look, I think there's generally a broader trend and momentum around what we classify as wokeism, which I think is a little bit disparaging to the intention of social justice and recognizing the primary points of social justice through action and behavior in civic discourse and government behavior. This, like the election of several DAs around the country who take a different stance to prosecution of crime to try and create better options for rehab and so on, I think is not a movement that's going to go away overnight. I think there's certainly a hefty amount of resistance. But what we're really doing right now is I think we're learning and realizing the boundaries of this movement and of this moment. The one boundary that I think San Franciscans or two boundaries, San Francisco, as in the case in tech, has always been so progressive in terms of, doing these things faster than anyone else. But what we're realizing in San Francisco is non-prosecution of criminals, as the DA has undertaken over the past couple of years, leads to really heinous crime and rampant crime. And this kind of social justice movement within the education system causes a decline in the value of our education system. Those are two really important learnings that San Francisco has had over the past couple of years with this very important and momentous kind of social justice movement. But it doesn't mean that the movement is over. It doesn't mean that quote unquote wokeism is over. It means that social justice intent is still there, but we're realizing where the boundaries are and how far things can and maybe should go.
I posted this article. Tyler Cowen, who's a pretty well-known economist, he wrote this op-ed for Bloomberg, and what he said is that wokeism has peaked. And there's just these two passages that builds on what Friedberg said. Quote, "By wokeism, I refer to a movement that on the positive side is highly aware of racism and social injustice and is galvanized towards raising awareness. On the negative side, it can be preachy, alienating, overly concerned with symbols, and self-righteous," unquote. And I think that probably does summarize sort of like where it starts, which is, I think, rooted in a very good place, but unfortunately all too often where it ends, which is that sort of moral, absolutist, judgment, cancel culture around it. And then the second quote that he said was the following. He said, quote, "Wokeism is likely to evolve into a subculture that is highly educated, highly white, and fairly feminine. That is, still a large mass of people, but not enough to run the country or all its major institutions. In the San Francisco school board recall, for instance, the role of Asian Americans was especially prominent," unquote. So I don't know. I just think that all these things sort of, people are looking for affiliation, and you start with labels that bring you in, and then you have to sort out, are all these labels really true, and how true are they? And I think we're in this moment now where now that we know the mechanism of action of wokeism, I just don't think it works anymore. And I think a lot of people will say, I believe in the high order ideals of racial and social justice, but I don't believe in the mechanism of action. And so
the pendulum swung too far. Yeah. But the core intent of a generation of change is underway, which is social justice and climate change. I think those are the two big points of concern.
It just won't be done with this cohort under this package.
Well, it won't be done to this extreme this fast, right? And I think that the pendulum went too fast, too far, and it's and there are boundary effects that are causing recourse right now, and we're seeing this across the country, especially in New York with the election of the mayor, and San Francisco, the DA recall's happening in the next couple of months. So, Sacks, what's your prediction on the DA recall, by the way?
Well, that's 95%. But I mean, to build on your point, they were talking about 10% of the people in the United States who are involved in this, retweeting and virtual signaling. And, is Twitter a real place? Well, no, a city's a real place. People have to live in San Francisco. And when these ideologies result in unlivable conditions for people, well, they're going to say, you know what? There's reality here. How do we get competent people to take the positions, Sacks, that are being vacated now? Who should London Breed put in these three positions? And maybe tech people need to, this is what I think has to happen. I think some number of tech people have to get off the bench and say, you know what, I'm going to do a tour of duty as politicians in San Francisco to take back the city. What should happen here in terms of who takes these positions? Because Republicans can't win in San Francisco, so you're going to need moderate Democrats, right, Sacks?
Before Sacks goes, can I just say something? Because I just want to say something that's really important. Sacks, I'm sorry to jump in, but J-Cal, I think the point you're making about the tech people implies the tech people are effective and good at doing this, but that's not necessarily the fabric of San Francisco. I've lived in San Francisco since 2001. The number of people in San Francisco in 2001 that were in the tech industry was a minority. Yeah. Since that time, it became a significant size. And over the last 2 years since the pandemic, it's decreased significantly. But San Francisco is a city with decades and generations of history. My wife's family is multi-generational San Franciscans. And I don't think that traditionally San Franciscans view tech people as the right people to solve these problems for them. That the intention of that city is not necessarily about let's get tech people to solve our problems. They have a different set of values, perhaps. And so we often overstate and assume that tech people are the right people and are the problem solvers. But I don't think that that's necessarily the right problems that people want to solve. So I just wanted to intervene.
Well, then who should take these positions? Because it's
people
typically really far left people are motivated to take these positions. I don't see business people writ large across all political, positions, but specifically in San Francisco, don't want to take these positions. So is this just going to be replayed, Sacks?
The recall effort was led by two parents, Autumn Lujan and Siva Raj. They're the ones who led this thing. They're the ones who rose up to basically oppose these crazy school board members. And that is who London Breed should talk to. She needs to go talk to the people who are successful in organizing this recall because they understand the issues, obviously, and the people are with them. So either appoint them to the board or ask them for their recommendations. And I think what you see consistently, whether it's with this SF school board or the school boards that we saw in Virginia that Youngkin very effectively ran against, is that they don't believe the parents matter. Terry McAuliffe's his last gaffe was basically saying that the parents shouldn't get to decide what is taught in the schools. He basically said the quiet part out loud. But that is what still across the country, the teachers unions believe, and most of the Democratic Party, the activists believe. And until they start losing elections, you're not going to see a change in that belief.
Oh my God, how awesome would it be if Sacks were on the school board?
Oh my God. Yeah. And just to put a pin in this, and the cherry on top, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors voted 7-4 to send a recall reform bill. So their reaction to all of this is to do a recall of recalls and say, now you can't recall somebody in their first year, and the people who are placed in these positions can't run again. So now the speculation is that 3 people who got voted off are going to run again. So there's a lot more to come on this.
Yeah,
story.
And also so they're putting just to add that they're putting that on the ballot on June 7th, the same day that we vote on the recall of Jason Boudin. The Board of Supervisors now put in this measure that would make it far harder to recall people. One of the provisions of that is whoever London Breed appoints as the successor, like you're talking about, they cannot run after that. So it is designed that makes no sense. They're basically
what if they do a great job?
Right, exactly. It makes no sense. So you have the Board of Supervisors trying to throw a wrench into the democratic process. Meanwhile, these are people who claim to be preserving democracy, saving democracy. They are trying to throw a wrench in the
thing is, underlying it, David, is they think they know better. That's what it fundamentally comes down to. They are willing to have democracy up to a point, and when that point is an unacceptable view by somebody else, they feel like they know better, and they're willing to be really draconian in whatever they do to decide.
Yeah.
And shout out to Mike Bloomberg. I'll pull up the tweet for everybody. He hasn't been very vocal or been on the stage much, but obviously he did a great job in New York on reforming schools. The San Francisco School Board recall should be a wake-up call to elected officials, especially Democrats across the nation. Parents are fed up with the status quo, and that puts adults ahead of kids.
Yeah, well,
and ideology ahead of results. Well said, Mike.
Yeah, well said,
Mr. Bloomberg.
Yes, that was very good. And Bloomberg has been very good on calling out the Democratic Party's blind loyalty to the teachers' unions. And until they're willing to break with the teachers' unions, who are their biggest donor, we're not going to get any real progress on school reform. And this is the issue. My favorite political commentator, one of them is Roy Teixeira, who's a Democrat. He wrote The Emerging Democratic Majority. He wrote a blog post talking about how Asian American voters are going to swing away from the Democratic Party because of issues like this, because of the decline of standards in school and safety. And the Asian American community, I think, is galvanized on this Chesa Boudin issue because they have seen in all these cases of Asian hate where elders in their community have been violently assaulted. Chesa Boudin has done nothing except release the perpetrators.
Bonkers. All right. Well,